Winter usually brings quiet, but 1998 brought only death. Snow fell for weeks, burying homes, suffocating towns. People froze inside their own living rooms. Down in a forgotten valley, one man prepared differently. Elias Fisher piled dirt and mud over his cabin until it resembled a natural mound of earth. Neighbors called him crazy. Friends abandoned him. He just kept digging. When temperatures plummeted to -50, civilization snapped. Power lines fell. Roads vanished. Survival required miracles. Inside his earthen bunker, Elias waited. His extreme paranoia became humanity's only remaining hope against nature's absolute coldest wrath. In the remote stretches of Boundary County, Idaho, where pine trees outnumber people 10,000 to 1, nature dictates the terms of existence. Most locals respected the harsh environment, leaning on generations of generational wisdom to survive the winters. But Elias Fisher did not rely on local folklore or the farmer's almanac. A retired geotechnical engineer who had spent 30 years studying permafrost and soil thermal dynamics in Alaska, Elias trusted only data. And in August of 1998, the data terrified him. Elias lived a solitary life in a sturdy standard A-frame log cabin situated at the base of a sweeping valley. It was a picturesque piece of land bordered by a rushing creek and dense timber. To the untrained eye, the late summer of 1998 was beautiful, marked by crisp mornings and unusually warm afternoons. But Elias noticed the anomalies. The local migratory birds had departed 3 weeks ahead of schedule. The squirrels were not just gathering nuts. They were stripping pine cones bare and burying them twice as deep as usual. More concerning were Elias's soil temperature readings. He kept a series of deep earth probes scattered across his property, a habit left over from his engineering days. By late August, the ground temperature at a depth of 4 feet had dropped by a staggering 6 degrees compared to the historical average. The earth was cooling from the inside out. He drove his battered pickup truck into town to visit Harrison's Hardware and Supply. Greg Harrison, the owner, was a jovial man who knew everyone's business and happily traded gossip over the counter. "Buying out my insulation again, Elias?" Greg asked, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag as Elias dragged 4 massive rolls of fiberglass batting to the register. "Just starting, Greg," Elias muttered, his eyes darting toward the window, looking at the clear blue sky as if it were a looming threat. "I need chicken wire, 2,000 square feet of it, and all the bentonite clay you have in the back, plus 50 bags of cement." Greg paused, his smile fading. "Elias, you planning to pour a new foundation? Winter is 2 months away. You won't get it to cure right." "I'm not pouring a foundation," Elias replied, his voice tight. "I'm burying the cabin." Greg stared at him, waiting for the punchline. When none came, he let out a nervous chuckle. "Burying it? Right. Well, I have the wire, but I'll have to order the clay. What exactly are you doing out there?" "Insulating," Elias said, handing over a thick stack of cash. "And Greg, I highly recommend you double your order for kerosene and heating coils. It's going to get bad." Word of Elias's bizarre purchase spread through the small town of Bonner's Ferry by nightfall. The town had long considered Elias an eccentric, harmless loner, a man who preferred his weather instruments to human company. But building a bunker that crossed the line from eccentric to unhinged. His closest neighbor was Sarah Jenkins, a resilient widow who ran a small cattle operation 5 miles down the dirt road. She lived with her 8-year-old son, Leo. A few days after Elias's trip to the hardware store, Sarah rode her horse over to Elias's property to check a shared fence line. What she saw made her pull back on the reins in shock. Elias's beautiful log cabin was being enveloped. He had wrapped the entire exterior walls, windows, and half the roof in a dense lattice of heavy-gauge chicken wire. He was currently standing on a scaffold using a massive shovel to slather a thick, wet mixture of dark earth clay and dry straw directly onto the logs. "Elias," Sarah called out, trotting closer, "what in God's name are you doing to your house?" Elias wiped a sweat-stained brow, his clothes plastered in mud. "Thermal mass, Sarah. The wood isn't enough, not for what's coming." It's going to rot the logs, she warned, looking at the catastrophic mess. You're trapping moisture against the wood. It'll collapse in 5 years. If I don't do this, we won't be here in 5 months. Elias shot back, his tone deadly serious. The jet stream is collapsing. We are going to see a localized polar vortex that will sit over this valley and refuse to move. The wind chill will drop past anything this town's infrastructure can handle. Sarah sighed, recognizing the feverish glint in his eye. Elias, it's September. It's 65 degrees out. Come inside, have some tea, and wash that muck off. No time, Elias grunted, turning back to his work. You should seal your drafty windows, Sarah, and bring your livestock into the main barn by Halloween. Don't wait for the snow. Sarah rode away, deeply unsettled, leaving Elias to his frantic labor. He was systematically transforming his home into an artificial hill, an earthen womb designed to defy the incoming freeze. By mid-October, the town's amusement had turned to genuine concern. Elias had not been to town in weeks. Delivery trucks dropping off supplies reported that the cabin was almost entirely gone. In its place stood a massive lumpy mound of dried mud, sprouting weeds from the sod he had packed onto the roof. Sheriff David Lawson, a pragmatic man who preferred to nip trouble in the bud, decided to pay Elias a visit. The county had received several anonymous complaints about the eyesore ruining the scenic valley, though Lawson knew those were just excuses. People were spooked. When Lawson's cruiser pulled up the gravel driveway, the sheriff stepped out and stared. It looked as if the earth had simply swelled up and swallowed the house. Only a heavy steel door recessed deep into a mud-caked tunnel indicated that humans lived inside. 2 thick PVC pipes protruded from the top of the mound ventilation shafts. Lawson knocked heavily on the steel door. It took a full minute before the locks disengaged, clicking with heavy mechanical precision. The door swung inward, revealing Elias. He looked thinner, his beard wild and untrimmed, but his eyes were sharp and lucid. "Sheriff," Elias said calmly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Just a welfare check," Elias Lawson said, peering past him. The air rushing out of the tunnel was surprisingly warm and smelled heavily of dry earth and wood smoke. "Folks are worried about you. You've built yourself a regular tomb out here. You got a permit for this kind of modification." "I'm a licensed engineer," David Elias replied. "The structural load is perfectly distributed. The log frame is reinforced with steel braces on the interior to handle the weight of the soil. And it's not a tomb, it's a thermal battery." Lawson sighed, resting his thumbs on his duty belt. "Elias, you're scaring people. You've got Sarah Jenkins half convinced the Ice Age is returning. What's the end game here?" Elias stepped back and gestured for the sheriff to enter. "Come inside. See for yourself." Hesitantly, Lawson stepped through the threshold. He passed through a small antechamber, an airlock he realized designed to prevent cold air from rushing in, and through a second heavy door. Inside, the transformation was astonishing. Despite the rough, dirt-caked exterior, the interior of the cabin was immaculate and incredibly comfortable. The temperature had to be a steady 70 degrees. A single, small cast-iron stove sat in the center of the room, burning just 2 small logs, yet the heat radiating from the walls was immense. Did 2 feet of compacted earth clay and straw. Elias explained, patting the interior wall. "Earth is a poor insulator by itself, but it has immense thermal mass. It absorbs the heat from the stove, stores it, and slowly radiates it back. Even if my fire goes out, it would take weeks for the interior temperature to drop below freezing. Furthermore, the earth blocks all wind. Wind chill cannot penetrate a hill." Lawson had to admit it was impressively engineered. "Okay, so you're warm, but you're isolated. What happens if the roof caves?" "It won't," Elias said firmly. "I've calculated the snow load for up to 20 feet. I have enough canned food and dried goods for 8 months. I have an underground cistern fed by a diverted underground spring. I am completely self-sufficient." "And the rest of us?" Lawson asked, an eyebrow raised. "Are we all just fools waiting to die?" "You're unprepared," Elias corrected him gently. "The power grid here relies on above-ground transmission lines that haven't been upgraded since the 1970s. The substation in Sandpoint is prone to freezing. When the temperature drops to -40 and the wind hits 60 miles an hour, those lines will snap. And no repair crew will be able to reach us. It's simple mathematics, David. Lawson shook his head. -40, Elias, the lowest recorded temperature here in November is maybe 10 degrees. You're preparing for an apocalypse that isn't coming. I hope you're right, Elias said, his voice void of any sarcasm. I truly do. Lawson left shortly after reporting back to the town that Elias was perfectly sane, just eccentric, and fiercely committed to his engineering project. The town collectively shrugged and moved on. The high school football team won the district championship. Thanksgiving approached, the days grew shorter. Then, on November 26th, the sky turned a deep bruised purple. The barometric pressure began to drop at a rate that made ears pop. The local weather station issued a severe winter storm, warning predicting heavy snowfall. But Elias's instruments painted a far more violent picture. A massive ridge of high pressure over Alaska was forcing Arctic air straight down the continent, funneling it directly into the Idaho Panhandle. It was a meteorological phenomenon known as a bomb cyclone, merging with a stagnant polar vortex. Elias sealed his blast doors. He checked his ventilation shafts, ensuring the external hoods were angled away from the prevailing winds. He stocked the wood stove. Outside, the first flakes began to fall. They were not light, fluffy crystals. They were heavy, hard pellets of ice driving horizontally on winds that were rapidly picking up speed. The great white death had arrived. The storm did not build gradually. It struck like a physical blow. Within 4 hours, visibility dropped to 0. The wind howled with a continuous deafening roar, sounding like a freight train eternally passing just outside the walls. Inside his earthen fortress, Elias sat in an armchair drinking black coffee. The silence inside the cabin was unnerving. The thick layer of mud and soil absorbed almost all external sound. He could only feel the faint vibrations of the most violent wind gusts rattling the deep earth. His thermometer read a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He was safe. But as he looked at the battery-powered ham radio sitting on his desk, his stomach churned. He tuned it to the local emergency frequency. At first, there was only static. Then, voices began to break through the interference painted with panic. Dispatch, this is County Plow 3. I'm off the road on Route 95. I can't see the hood of my truck. Engine is stalling. Harrison's hardware roof is groaning. We've got heavy accumulation need. Power's flickering on Elm Street. At 2:14 a.m. on November 27th, the lights in Elias's cabin flickered, died, and never came back on. The grid had failed. The next morning, the storm showed no signs of stopping. Elias put on his heavy parka and ski goggles to check the external environment. Opening the double doors of his airlock required immense physical effort. The wind immediately tried to slam the steel shut. Stepping outside, the cold hit him like a physical wall of knives. His breath froze instantly on his beard. He checked his external thermometer shielded beneath a wooden awning. It read -42 degrees Fahrenheit. With wind speeds easily topping 60 miles per hour, the wind chill was approaching -80 degrees Fahrenheit. Exposed flesh would suffer deep frostbite in less than 5 minutes. Breathing the air directly burned the lungs. The world had been erased, replaced by a churning vortex of white. Snow had drifted up to 8 feet high in places burying familiar landmarks. Elias retreated into his airlock, sealing the door behind him and shivering violently as he stripped off the frozen outer layers. He had survived his first foray into the storm, but the reality of the situation outside was devastating. If the power was out, the town was dying. He moved to the ham radio, trying to pick up signals. The local chatter had descended into chaos. Sheriff Lawson, do you copy? This is Greg Harrison. The roof over the lumber aisle just collapsed. We've got a dozen people huddled in the basement, but the generator won't start. The diesel has gelled. Greg, stay put. Do not go outside. Lawson's voice crackled, barely audible over the static. We cannot get vehicles out of the station. The snowplows are frozen solid. Radiator blocks cracked. We are officially immobilized. Elias listened, his heart heavy. His paranoia had been entirely justified, but there was no joy in being right. He was sitting in a warm, comfortable room, while just a few miles away, people he knew were slowly freezing to death in the dark. Suddenly, a weak voice cut through the static on a different channel. "Help! Anyone copy? This is Sarah Jenkins. Please." Elias bolted upright, grabbing the microphone. Sarah, this is Elias. I hear you. What's your situation?" Static hissed for agonizing seconds before her voice returned, trembling and faint. "Elias, the power went out last night. The backup oil pump for the furnace, it froze. The pipes burst an hour ago. The house is flooding with water and it's freezing on the floor. Leo and I are under every blanket we own, but it's so cold, Elias. Leo isn't shivering anymore." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. When a hypothermic person stops shivering, it means their body has exhausted its energy reserves and is shutting down. Death is imminent. "Sarah, listen to me," Elias commanded, his voice sharp. "You cannot stay there. You have to move." "Can't," she sobbed. "The truck is buried. It won't start anyway. We'll die if we walk outside." She was right. 5 miles in a -80 degrees Fahrenheit wind chill was a death sentence, especially for a child. Elias looked around his secure, impenetrable mud bunker. He had spent months building the perfect defense to lock the world out. He was completely safe here. He had food, warmth, and security. To step outside was to risk his own life against impossible odds. He looked at the deep winter survival gear hanging on the wall, the snowshoes, the extreme weather sleeping bags, the heavy sled he used for hauling firewood. He remembered Leo, the 8-year-old boy who used to wave at him from the fence line, entirely innocent of the harshness of the world. "Sarah," Elias said into the radio, his voice steadying, "bundle him up in everything you have. Put plastic bags over your socks. Wrap scarves over your faces so no skin is exposed. Wait for me." "Elias, what are you doing?" "I'm coming to get you." Elias dropped the microphone. He began pulling on his heavy thermal layers, methodically preparing for war against the elements. He loaded his sled with heavy wool blankets, chemical heat packs, and a thermos of boiling water. He strapped on his snowshoes. He stood before his heavy steel door. Outside, the wind shrieked a monster trying to tear the earth apart. Elias took a deep breath, gripped the frozen handle, and pushed his way out of the earth, stepping into the white void. Stepping out of the airlock was like stepping into the exhaust of a jet engine that was pumping liquid nitrogen. The wind immediately grabbed Elias Fisher's heavy canvas parka, whipping it against his frame with violent percussive snaps. He pulled his thick neoprene face mask up to his ski goggles, ensuring not a single millimeter of skin was exposed to the monstrous cold. With a wind chill plummeting past -80 degrees, the air was no longer just weather. It was a caustic, flesh-destroying entity. He leaned forward, adjusting the heavy nylon harness across his chest. Behind him, the 6-foot high-density polyethylene expedition sled dragged in the fresh powder. It was currently loaded with 80 pounds of survival gear sleeping bags, rated for Everest base camps, chemical heat packs, a camp stove, and thermoses of boiling water. But the sled felt remarkably heavy right from the start. The snow was not packing down. It was light crystalline and bottomless, behaving more like dry sand than typical wet Idaho snow. Elias activated his handheld GPS, shielded inside a heavy plastic sleeve tethered to his wrist. The screen was sluggish in the extreme cold, but it registered his pre-programmed waypoint, the Jenkins farm, exactly 5.2 miles to the northwest. He checked his analog magnetic compass, trusting physics over batteries, and took his first step off his property line. The journey was an exercise in sensory deprivation. The world was stripped of color, reduced to a blinding, chaotic whiteout. The roar of the wind deafened him, a continuous mechanical shriek that vibrated deep within his chest. He could not see the tops of the massive Douglas firs that lined the county road. He could barely see the tips of his own snowshoes. He navigated by memory and the subtle slope of the terrain beneath his feet, keeping the invisible tree line to his right as a guide rail. For the first 2 miles, adrenaline fueled his pace. He established a rhythm slide, the left shoe plant. The poles dragged the sled slide, the right shoe. But the environment was actively trying to kill him. The moisture from his own breath began to freeze on the inside of his goggles. forcing him to scrape the ice away with a clumsy, heavily gloved thumb every few minutes. Every time he inhaled, the frozen air bypassed the warmth of his scarf, burning the back of his throat and sending jagged shards of pain deep into his lungs. At mile 3, the terrain betrayed him. The county road dipped into a natural ravine known locally as Dead Man's Hollow. It was typically a scenic valley pass, but the bomb cyclone had turned it into a wind tunnel. As Elias descended into the hollow, the crosswinds hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was thrown off balance, tumbling sideways into a snowdrift that swallowed him whole. Panic, sharp and sudden, spiked in his chest. In deep powder, struggling only buries you deeper. He forced himself to go limp, letting the snow settle around him. He was completely submerged, entombed in white. He slowly brought his arms up, pressing his snowshoes down to create a packed base, and fought his way back to the surface like a man swimming out of an avalanche. When he finally breached the surface, gasping for air that felt like broken glass, he realized the sled had flipped. He spent a precious, agonizing 10 minutes righting the sled and checking the bindings in the blinding storm. As he pushed forward through the bottom of the ravine, a massive dark shape loomed out of the whiteout directly in his path. It was a centuries-old ponderosa pine, easily 4 feet in diameter, which had been snapped cleanly in half by the gale-force winds. It lay directly across the road, its shattered branches creating a dense, impenetrable wall of timber and packed snow. Elias stopped, his chest heaving. He could not go through it. He looked to the left, a steep, heavily timbered incline. He looked to the right, a sharp drop-off into a frozen creek bed. Bypassing the tree meant taking the heavy sled off the relatively flat road and maneuvering it over a steep, unstable drift hovering over the creek. He unclipped the harness, leaving the sled behind, and began stomping a trail over the snowdrift to his right. The snow creaked ominously beneath him. It was a wind slab, a hardened layer of snow resting over loose powder highly prone to collapsing. He moved with agonizing slowness, testing every step. Once he had packed down a precarious 2-foot-wide path around the fallen pine, he returned to the sled. He didn't wear the harness this time. He grabbed the front haul loops with his hands and dragged the sled backward, pulling it inch by inch over the treacherous snow bridge. The muscles in his back screamed, cramping in the brutal cold. Suddenly, the snow beneath his right foot gave way. His leg plunged down to the hip, suspended over the dark void of the frozen creek below. The sled tipped dangerously, threatening to slide down and drag him with it. With a guttural roar, Elias threw his weight forward onto his stomach, digging the serrated claws of his left snowshoe into the ice, and hauled himself and the sled onto the solid ground of the road ahead. He lay there for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, before forcing himself back to his feet. 2 miles left. He checked his watch. It had taken him 3 hours to cover 3 miles. The temperature was still dropping. If he didn't hurry, he wouldn't be performing a rescue. He would be performing a recovery. When Elias finally saw the silhouette of the Jenkins farmhouse, his relief was instantly crushed by dread. The house looked dead. Normally, a welcoming 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch, the structure was now a monolithic block of rime ice. The relentless wind had plastered snow against the windward walls so thickly that the first-floor windows were entirely buried. There was no smoke rising from the chimney. There was no light. It looked like a shipwreck at the bottom of a frozen ocean. Elias unclipped his harness and left the sled on the porch. He approached the front door, sweeping away a waist-high drift with his heavy boots. He grabbed the brass doorknob. It didn't turn. It was frozen solid, the internal mechanisms fused by ice. He stepped back and threw his shoulder against the heavy oak door. It didn't budge. He hit it again, ignoring the blinding pain radiating down his arm. The wood groaned, but held fast. "Sarah!" He bellowed, though he knew the wind snatched the words away before they even left his mouth. He unholstered the heavy steel ice axe, hanging from his hip, a tool he had brought specifically to clear his own ventilation shafts, and brought the pick end down hard against the doorframe right beside the deadbolt. Wood splintered. He struck it again and again, hacking away the frozen timber, until the locking mechanism was exposed and ruined. With one final brutal kick, The front door burst inward. Elias stumbled into the foyer, and the temperature difference was negligible. It was easily -20 degrees inside the house. The living room was a nightmare. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp crackle of Elias's boots stepping onto the hardwood floor. Except it wasn't hardwood anymore. It was a solid sheet of ice. Sarah had mentioned the pipes bursting. The water had cascaded through the ceiling from the upstairs bathroom, flooding the ground floor before freezing into a treacherous glassy rink. Long, jagged icicles hung from the blades of the ceiling fan and the edges of the fireplace mantel. "Sarah!" Elias shouted, his voice echoing hollowly through the frozen tomb. Silence. He clicked on a heavy tactical flashlight, cutting a beam through the frigid gloom. He moved carefully across the ice, checking the kitchen, the living room, and the downstairs study. Empty. He moved toward the stairs. The carpeted steps were slick with frozen waterfalls. He climbed on his hands and knees, the ice axe biting into the wood to give him purchase. He found them in the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The bed had been dragged into the center of the room, away from the drafting windows. It was piled high with every blanket, quilt, and comforter in the house. Elias rushed forward, tearing back the heavy layers. Sarah Jenkins lay curled in a tight fetal position, her lips a terrifying shade of slate blue, her skin pale as wax. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was so shallow it was practically imperceptible. Tucked tight against her chest was 8-year-old Leo. Elias stripped off his heavy outer mittens, leaving only his thin liner gloves, and pressed 2 fingers against Sarah's carotid artery. The pulse was there, but it was thready, slow, and irregular. He checked Leo. The boy's skin was ice cold to the touch. He wasn't shivering. They were deep into stage 3 hypothermia. Their core temperatures had likely dropped below 85 degrees. At this stage, the heart muscle becomes highly irritable. Rough handling or sudden movements could trigger ventricular fibrillation, a fatal heart attack. They were balancing on the razor's edge of death. "Sarah," Elias said softly, leaning close to her ear. "Sarah, it's Elias. I'm here." Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't open them. She let out a low, incoherent moan that sounded more like an exhale of dust than a human voice. Elias had to work fast, but he had to work carefully. He could not simply drag them out. He needed to trap whatever residual body heat they had left and introduce external warmth slowly. He opened his pack and pulled out 2 heavy mylar space blankets, the crinkly, reflective silver sheets designed to reflect radiant body heat back to the wearer. Moving with agonizing gentleness, he rolled Sarah slightly, sliding the mylar beneath her, then wrapping it tightly around her torso. He did the same for Leo. Next came the chemical heat packs. He cracked them to activate the chemical reaction and placed them in strategic locations where major arteries ran close to the surface, the armpits, the groin, and the back of the neck. He had to wrap the packs in spare socks to ensure they didn't burn their cold, desensitized skin. He unscrewed the cap of his thermal flask. Steam billowed into the freezing room. It was heavily sugared warm tea, calories and heat combined. He propped Sarah's head up gently. "Drink. You have to swallow, Sarah." He pressed the cup to her blue lips. Instinct took over, and she swallowed, coughing weakly as the warm liquid hit her frozen throat. He managed to get a few ounces into her, then repeated the process with Leo, who barely responded, but reflexively swallowed the liquid pooling in his mouth. Now came the hardest part, the extraction. Elias unrolled the 2 extreme weather sleeping bags he had brought. They were heavy mummy-style bags rated for -40 degrees. He carefully maneuvered Sarah into one, zipping it up to her chin and pulling the insulated hood tight around her head. He did the same for Leo. He realized that he could not carry them both down the icy stairs. He had to drag them. He wrapped a thick nylon rope around the chest of Sarah's sleeping bag, creating a makeshift harness. Gripping the rope, he pulled her off the bed and onto the floor. He slowly slid her out of the bedroom, down the hall, and to the top of the stairs. He descended first, bracing his boots against the wall, and eased her down step by icy step, ensuring her head didn't hit the floorboards. He left her in the foyer and went back for Leo. By the time both of them were at the front door, Elias was drenched in sweat beneath his parka. This was incredibly dangerous. If he stopped moving, that sweat would freeze, accelerating his own hypothermia. He stepped out onto the porch into the howling void. The sled was waiting. He lifted Leo, first placing the boy at the front of the sled. He then lifted Sarah, laying her behind her son. He strapped them down tightly with nylon webbing, securing them like cargo to ensure they wouldn't roll out if the sled tipped. Elias looked at the load. Together, Sarah and Leo weighed roughly 210 pounds. The sleeping bags and gear added another 50. He was about to drag over 250 pounds of dead weight through miles of waist-deep powder into the teeth of a -80-degree blizzard. He clipped the heavy steel carabiner of the sled harness onto his chest rig. He looked out into the absolute white darkness of the storm. There was no road visible. There was no sky. There was only the screaming wind. He leaned forward, let out a ragged breath, and took the first step. The sled didn't move. Elias dropped to his knees, dug his snowshoes deep into the packed snow of the porch, and threw his entire upper body weight forward. The harness bit viciously into his collarbones. The heavy polyethylene sled scraped against the ice, groaned loudly, and finally slid forward off the porch. The return journey began, and within the first 100 yards, Elias knew he was in catastrophic trouble. On the way to the Jenkins farm, the wind had been hitting him from the side. Now, heading back south toward his valley, he was marching directly into the teeth of the gale. The wind was a solid physical wall pushing against his chest, trying to hurl him backward. The snow drove directly into his face, feeling like a sandblaster stripping away layers of plastic and neoprene. He could no longer slide his snowshoes. He had to lift his legs high, marching like a man wading through thick mud, pulling the massive dead weight of the sled behind him. Every step required a conscious, agonizing command from his brain to his muscles. 1, 2, 3. He began counting his steps. It was the only way to keep his mind from fracturing under the physical torment. He would count to 50, then stop for exactly 10 seconds to catch his breath, then count to 50 again. By the end of the first mile, his legs were trembling uncontrollably. Lactic acid flooded his thighs, turning his muscles to lead. The sled felt like it was anchored to the center of the earth. The snowdrifts had deepened in the hours since he had passed through, completely erasing his previous tracks. He was breaking trail all over again, but this time he was hauling the weight of 2 human lives. At mile 2, Elias's body began to betray him. The extreme exertion in the hyper-cooled air was taking its toll. His lungs burned with a fiery intensity, the cold air damaging the delicate alveoli with every frantic gasp. His vision began to narrow the edges of his sight, turning a fuzzy dark gray despite the blinding white snow. It was a classic sign of oxygen deprivation and exhaustion. He stopped, leaning heavily on his ski poles, his head bowed. "I can't," a small, treacherous voice whispered in his mind. "It's too heavy. Just lie down, just for a minute." The urge to collapse into the soft, freezing powder was overwhelming. It looked so comfortable. He knew that if he sat down, he would never get back up. The cold would seep into his bones, the pain would fade into a warm, lethargic dream, and the 3 of them would become permanent fixtures of the winter landscape. He turned his head slowly, looking back at the sled. He could barely see the outlines of the sleeping bags beneath the accumulating snow. Leo and Sarah were completely silent. He didn't even know if they were still alive. "Not today," Elias croaked aloud, his voice lost instantly to the wind. "Data doesn't quit. I don't quit." He gritted his teeth, leaned forward into the harness, and pushed. As they approached Dead Man's Hollow, the ravine where the fallen tree lay, disaster struck. Elias was navigating the steep, treacherous bypass he had carved out earlier, pulling the sled sideways along the snowbank. Suddenly, a massive gust of wind roared down the ravine. The sled fishtailed, sliding violently down the embankment toward the frozen creek. The sudden immense force jerked Elias backward. There was a sharp, loud snap that echoed even over the wind. Elias fell hard onto his chest, sliding several feet down the drift. He scrambled frantically, digging his gloved hands into the snow to halt his momentum. He looked up. The primary nylon strap connecting his chest rig to the left side of the sled had snapped under the sudden tension. The sled was resting precariously on the edge of the drop-off, held only by the right strap. If the right strap snapped, Sarah and Leo would plunge 20 feet down onto the jagged ice of the creek bed. Elias scrambled down to the sled, his heart pounding in his throat. He had to reattach the broken strap to the heavy metal D-ring on the sled, but the thick frozen nylon webbing was impossible to manipulate with his bulky expedition mittens. He had no choice. He bit the cuff of his right mitten and yanked it off, exposing his thin, sweaty liner glove to the -80-degree air. The moisture on the thin fabric froze, instantly turning the glove rigid. His fingers screamed in agony as the extreme cold bit into his flesh. He fumbled with the broken strap, trying to thread it back through the metal buckle and tie a secure water knot. His manual dexterity vanished within seconds. His fingers felt like thick wooden blocks. The metal buckle burned his skin through the liner like a hot iron. "Come on, come on!" He muttered, tears of pain freezing on his eyelashes. With a final desperate pull, he secured the knot. He jammed his frozen claw-like hand back into the thick mitten, burying it in his armpit to try and restore circulation. He knew he had just sustained frostbite. The only question was how many fingers he would lose. He crawled back up the embankment, grabbed the repaired harness, and hauled the sled over the crest. The final 2 miles were a blur of hallucination and agony. Elias lost track of time. He lost track of his step count. He operated on pure primal survival instinct, his mind retreating deep inside his skull to escape the torment of his failing body. He imagined he was walking on a treadmill in a warm laboratory in Alaska. He imagined he was sitting by his wood stove drinking coffee. When his GPS finally beeped, signaling he had reached his waypoint, he didn't believe it. He stopped and looked up. Through the swirling vortex of white, a massive, unnatural shape broke the flat horizon. It was the mound, his mud cabin. A surge of desperate energy flooded his system. He dragged the sled up the driveway, fighting through the massive drifts that had accumulated against the earthen walls. But as he approached the steel door of the airlock, horror washed over him. The wind had shifted during his absence. A massive 10-foot snowdrift had completely buried the entrance tunnel. Furthermore, looking up, he saw that one of his PVC ventilation pipes was heavily encrusted with rime ice, nearly choking off the airflow to the cabin below. He unclipped the harness, letting it drop to the snow. He grabbed his snow shovel strapped to his pack and began digging frantically at the drift blocking the door. His arms felt like wet noodles, lacking all strength, but terror drove the blade. He moved hundreds of pounds of snow, clearing a narrow trench down to the steel handle. He grabbed the handle, punched in the mechanical code with his numb club-like hands, and pulled. The heavy door groaned and swung open. The dark, relatively warm air of the airlock spilled out. Elias grabbed the haul loops of the sled. He didn't walk backward this time. He grabbed the front of Sarah's sleeping bag, hoisted her upper body, and practically dragged her down the snow trench and over the threshold into the airlock. He went back, grabbed Leo, and carried the boy inside, laying him next to his mother. He stepped inside the small concrete room and grabbed the heavy handle of the outer door. As he pulled the steel door shut, locking the screaming blizzard outside, the sudden absolute silence of the bunker hit him like a physical shock. Elias Fisher slumped against the cold steel door, sliding down until he hit the floor. His vision went completely black, and as his head hit the concrete, he finally let the darkness take him. Consciousness returned to Elias Fisher, not as a sudden awakening, but as a slow, agonizing crawl out of a deep trench. The first sensation was a throbbing, rhythmic agony radiating from his right hand. The second was the smell of damp wool and wood smoke. He opened his eyes. The dim, warm light of the cabin's battery-powered lanterns cast long shadows across the curved earthen ceiling. He was lying on the floor of the main living space, halfway out of his heavy parka. The fire in the cast-iron stove had burned down to glowing embers, but the massive thermal mass of the mud walls was doing exactly what it was engineered to do, radiating a steady, life-saving heat. Elias forced himself into a sitting position, grunting as his bruised ribs protested. He looked down at his right hand. It was swollen, the skin a mottled, terrifying patchwork of waxy white and deep bruised purple. Blisters the size of quarters were already forming along his knuckles. Severe frostbite. He knew from his years in Alaska that the tissue damage was extensive. He would likely lose the tips of his index and middle fingers, perhaps more. But the pain meant the nerves were still firing. It meant he was alive. He pushed the agony aside his mind, snapping back to the mission. He crawled across the floor toward the heavy sleeping bags he had dragged into the center of the room. "Sarah!" He rasped, his throat raw from the caustic frozen air he had inhaled during the trek. He unzipped the top of the first sleeping bag. Sarah Jenkins lay still, but the terrifying slate-blue hue had left her lips replaced by a pale, chalky white. As Elias watched, a violent tremor racked her body. Her jaw clenched and she began to shake uncontrollably. Elias let out a long, ragged exhale of relief. Shivering was the body's autonomic response to generate heat. When he had found them, they were too cold to shiver. The return of the tremors meant her core temperature was finally climbing back over 90 degrees. She was clawing her way out of the abyss. He checked Leo next. The boy was also shivering, though less violently, his small chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm. Elias knew the danger was far from over. Rewarming shock, a sudden drop in blood pressure caused by cold blood rushing from the extremities back to the heart, could still cause cardiac arrest. He dragged himself to the small kitchenette, filled a heavy iron kettle from his indoor cistern, and placed it on the stove, stoking the embers with fresh, dry cedar logs. For the next 8 hours, Elias operated purely on mechanical discipline. He prepared lukewarm sugar water, waking Sarah and Leo just enough to force them to drink a few ounces at a time. He rotated the chemical heat packs, ensuring they didn't burn the victim's skin as sensation slowly returned. He monitored their pulses, listening to the wind outside, howling like a wounded animal battered against the 2-foot-thick walls of packed earth. Around 3 a.m, Sarah finally opened her eyes with a degree of lucidity. She blinked her pupils, adjusting to the lantern light. She looked at the curved mud walls, the glowing stove, and finally at Elias, who sat slumped in a chair beside her, his right hand wrapped in clean gauze. "Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's right beside you," Elias said softly. "He's asleep. His temperature is stabilizing." Sarah turned her head slowly, seeing the small lump in the sleeping bag next to her. A single tear escaped her eye, tracking down her pale cheek. She looked back at Elias. "The wind," she murmured. "I can't hear the wind." "We're underground, essentially," Elias explained, leaning back. "The earth absorbs the sound and the cold." "You came," she said, the reality of the situation finally settling into her thawing mind. "You walked through that." "I did." "Why?" Elias looked at his bandaged hand, then at the sturdy log framing holding up the thousands of pounds of dirt above their heads. "Because having a fortress doesn't mean much if you have to sit in it alone, Sarah. Get some rest. The storm isn't over." For 5 days, the bomb cyclone sat parked over Boundary County, a stagnant vortex of Arctic misery. Inside the bunker, time lost all meaning. Without the sun to dictate the hours, Elias, Sarah, and Leo existed in a perpetual twilight, relying on Elias's wind-up clocks to maintain a schedule. Sarah and Leo slowly regained their strength. The boy, possessing the resilient elasticity of youth, bounced back faster. By the 3rd day, he was sitting up eating rehydrated stew and watching Elias tend to the fire. Sarah took longer. Her hands and feet ached constantly with nerve pain as the tissue recovered from the deep chill, but she had avoided severe frostbite. Elias, however, was quietly suffering. The blisters on his right hand had popped, leaving raw, agonizing tissue. He treated it with antibacterial ointment and sterile dressings from his extensive medical kit, but without systemic antibiotics, infection was a looming threat. He kept his hand heavily bandaged and hidden from Leo. On the morning of the 6th day, the atmosphere inside the cabin changed. Elias was sitting at his desk, trying to tune the ham radio with his left hand. The airwaves had been dead for 3 days. No emergency broadcasts, no static chatter from Greg Harrison or Sheriff Lawson. The silence was heavier than the dirt on the roof. Sarah was boiling water on the stove for morning oatmeal when she paused, rubbing her temples. "Elias, do you have any aspirin? I have a splitting headache." Elias looked up. "A headache where?" "Right behind my eyes. It feels like a band tightening." Elias frowned. He looked at Leo, who was sitting on his cot, rubbing his eyes and yawning continuously. A cold knot of dread formed in Elias's stomach. He stood up abruptly and walked to the cast-iron stove. The fire was burning sluggishly. The flames were not their usual bright dancing yellow and orange. They were a lazy, sickly blue, producing an unusual amount of smoke that seemed to hover in the room rather than drawing up the chimney. He rushed to the far wall where he kept a battery-powered carbon monoxide detector. He had removed the batteries weeks ago to use in his GPS unit, assuming he would replace them later. A fatal oversight. "Sarah, stop the fire," Elias commanded, his voice sharp. "Pour water on it, now!" "What, Elias? It's our heat source." "Do it," he yelled, grabbing a bucket of water and dousing the flames himself. A hiss of steam filled the room. "What is wrong?" Sarah coughed as the smoke billowed. "The ventilation," Elias said, pointing to the ceiling. "When I came back with you, I saw the intake pipe was heavily iced over. The wind has continued to pile snow on top of the mound. The exhaust flue for the stove and the main air intake are buried. We're breathing our own recycled air, and the stove is pumping carbon monoxide into the room because the draft is choked." Sarah's face paled. She grabbed Leo, pulling him close. "How much time do we have? With 3 people consuming oxygen in a sealed, earth-packed room, hours. Maybe less before the CO levels become lethal." Elias grabbed his heavy ice axe. He couldn't go outside. The airlock tunnel was buried under 10 feet of snow. Digging out would take hours they didn't have, and opening the door might collapse the snow tunnel inward, sealing them permanently. He had to clear the pipes from the inside. He moved a heavy wooden table directly under the main 4-inch PVC intake pipe protruding from the ceiling. He climbed onto the table, balancing precariously. He reached up with his uninjured left hand and unscrewed the interior grating. He shone his flashlight up the pipe. About 4 feet up, the pipe was completely blocked by a solid plug of white ice. The moisture from their breath combined with the extreme exterior cold had created a frozen dam. "I need to break it," Elias muttered. He gripped the shaft of the heavy ice axe with his left hand. Holding a 3-pound tool over his head with his non-dominant hand was difficult. Doing it with bruised ribs and a body exhausted by a rescue mission was nearly impossible. He thrust the handle of the axe up into the pipe, using the blunt pommel to strike the ice plug. Thud. It felt like hitting a concrete wall. "Hit it harder," Sarah urged, holding the table steady. Her breathing was becoming shallow. Elias struck again, putting his shoulder into the upward thrust. Crack. A small shower of ice shavings fell onto his face. He kept striking over and over, his muscles screaming in protest. The headache was setting in for him now, a dull, rhythmic pounding at the base of his skull. The air in the cabin was growing stale, heavy, and metallic. On the 20th strike, his left arm gave out. The axe slipped the heavy steel pick, grazing his shoulder as it fell, tearing a gash in his shirt. He dropped to his knees on the table, gasping for breath. The lack of oxygen was accelerating his fatigue. "Elias," Sarah said softly. Her voice was slurred. She was sitting on the floor, now holding Leo, who had fallen into an unnatural, heavy sleep. Elias looked at his right hand, the heavily bandaged, frost-bitten hand. He had no choice. He stood back up. He grabbed the shaft of the ice axe with both hands, ignoring the blinding white-hot agony that immediately shot up his right arm as his ruined fingers gripped the metal. He squeezed his eyes shut, let out a guttural roar, and drove the handle of the axe upward with every ounce of remaining strength in his body. Crash! The ice plug shattered. A sudden violent rush of freezing pure Arctic air cascaded down the pipe, hitting Elias directly in the face. It was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. He dropped the axe and fell back onto the table, laughing and coughing as the heavy toxic air in the cabin was rapidly displaced by the frigid oxygen of the storm. He crawled down and immediately opened the chimney flue wide, letting the updraft clear the remaining smoke. "Breathe, Sarah." He gasped, crawling over to her. Deep breaths. Within minutes, the heavy fog lifted from their minds. The crisis was averted, but the cold was creeping back in. Elias had to start the fire again, carefully monitoring the draw to ensure the pipes remained clear. They had survived the choking dark, but the true test awaited them outside. On the 14th day, the howling stopped. It didn't fade away gradually. It simply ceased, leaving a ringing, profound silence in its wake. Elias, Sarah, and Leo sat in the cabin listening intently. There was no vibration in the earth, no shriek of the wind. Elias walked to his analog barometer. The needle, which had been buried in the extreme low-pressure zone for 2 weeks, was steadily climbing. The bomb cyclone had finally broken. "It's over," Elias announced quietly. Digging out took 6 hours. Elias and Sarah took turns in the airlock using short trenching shovels to carve a tunnel upward through the massive snowdrift that had buried the entrance. When Elias finally breached the surface, the bright, blinding sunlight forced him to squeeze his eyes shut. When his vision adjusted, he climbed out onto the surface of the snow and pulled Sarah and Leo up after him. They stood in absolute awe. The world they knew was gone. The geography of the valley had been entirely rewritten. The towering Douglas firs were snapped like matchsticks, their splintered trunks protruding from snowdrifts that were in some places 20 feet high. The winding county road had vanished under a rolling ocean of white. The temperature was still bitterly cold, perhaps 10 degrees above zero, but without the wind, it felt like a tropical spring compared to what they had endured. Elias looked down at his home. From the surface, there was no sign a cabin existed. It was just a smooth, undulating hill of snow, pierced only by the tops of his PVC ventilation pipes. His paranoid architecture had worked flawlessly. "We need to get to town," Elias said, his voice grim. "We need to see who's left." He retrieved his emergency snowshoes and 2 extra pairs he kept for guests. The trek back toward Bonner's Ferry was slow, but the packed wind-slabbed snow made walking easier than it had been during the storm. As they crested the ridge overlooking the town, the true devastation became apparent. Bonner's Ferry looked like it had been subjected to a sustained bombing campaign. The roofs of several commercial buildings, including Harrison's Hardware, had collapsed under the immense weight of the snow. Power lines lay tangled across the streets like dead black snakes. Dozens of cars and trucks were completely buried, marked only by the strange mounds in the roadway. Smoke was rising from only a handful of chimneys. They made their way down into the main street. The silence was eerie. As they approached the sheriff's station, the heavy wooden doors pushed open. Sheriff David Lawson stepped out, bundled in 3 layers of coats, carrying a heavy iron pry bar. He looked 10 years older. His face was hollow, his beard unkempt, his eyes carrying the haunted look of a man who had seen too much death. Lawson stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the 3 figures approaching. He dropped the pry bar. "Elias Lawson," croaked, stepping forward in disbelief. "Sarah Leo." Sarah broke into a run despite her snowshoes and threw her arms around the sheriff. Lawson hugged her back, burying his face in her shoulder. "We thought you were gone," Lawson whispered, his voice cracking. "The farm. We got a snowmobile out there 2 days ago when the wind dipped. Found the front door smashed in and the whole place frozen solid. We thought you wandered out and died in the drifts." "We would have," Sarah sobbed, pulling back and pointing at Elias. "If he hadn't come for us. He dragged us 5 miles through the storm." Lawson looked at Elias. He looked at the man he had called crazy, the man he had patronized for building a mud bunker. He saw Elias's heavily bandaged right hand, the gauntness of his face, the fierce, unyielding set of his jaw. "The town?" Elias asked simply. Lawson swallowed hard, shaking his head. "It's bad, Elias. We lost a lot of folks. The grid failed on the first night. People burned furniture, clothes, anything they could, but the wind chill ripped the heat right out of the houses, the old folks' home. It was a nightmare. Greg Harrison managed to keep 12 people alive in his basement with a kerosene heater, but..." Lawson paused, wiping his eyes. "We weren't ready. Nobody was ready for this." "The earth provides," Elias said softly, "but you have to know how to ask it." In the weeks that followed, the military arrived. National Guard helicopters dropped supplies, and heavy machinery slowly carved the town out of its frozen tomb. The official death toll in the county reached 34. It was the deadliest winter event in Idaho's history. Elias Fisher became a local legend. The town that had once mocked him now viewed him with a mixture of awe and profound respect. The county commissioners even consulted him on upgrading the town's emergency shelters, utilizing the thermal mass engineering he had proven in the ultimate crucible. Elias lost the top two joints of his right index and middle fingers to frostbite. He wore the loss not as a badge of honor, but as a permanent reminder of the margin of error in the wild. Years later, when the snows began to fall and the temperatures dropped, the people of Bonner's Ferry didn't just look at the sky. They looked toward the valley, toward the strange, mud-covered hill that hid a cabin. And they remembered the man who had buried his house to fight the winter, proving that sometimes the only way to survive the end of the world is to dig in and refuse to let it take you. Elias Fisher started as the town eccentric, the man who buried his own home under tons of dirt, while the rest of the world laughed. But when the bomb cyclone of 1998 shattered the illusions of modern safety, that very mud became an impenetrable shield against nature's deadliest wrath. His story is a chilling reminder of how fragile our modern infrastructure truly is when the atmosphere turns against us. Elias didn't just survive. He marched into a negative 80-degree void to pull two innocent people back from the brink of a frozen death. His earthen fortress stood unyielding, a monument to human foresight, data-driven paranoia, and the raw primal will to live. It makes you wonder, if the grid collapsed tonight and the ultimate winter descended, what would be your mud cabin? How far would you go to survive the choking dark? If Elias's unbelievable real-life story of extreme survival kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share this video with someone who respects true grit and preparation. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into history's most intense real-life survival dramas.